are talking Dark Parasite, which is a science fiction movie from Italy. So it isn't actually an Italian movie, but it's spoken in English language and follows the story of three criminals. After a kind of heist, they steal a mysterious suitcase and hide out in this kind of abandoned building, which is a series of tunnels underneath. Unbeknownst to them, there is a homeless man living in these tunnels who has been infected by a strange alien parasite which has come down from a meteorite some time before. And this now infected homeless man causes big problems for this trio of criminals. What will happen? You will have to watch the movie and find out. So let's talk about Dark Parasite. I can't help but wonder if the CGI model for this monster in Dark Parasite was taken from the movie Desert Shadows, because it looks exactly the same as far as I can tell. But anyway, let's talk about CGI, because this is clearly a low budget movie and the visual effects are primarily computer enhanced. And I gotta be honest with you, for a low budget movie, I was quite impressed. I actually didn't think it was too bad. I mean, yes, there are some clearly CGI effects, in particular from the actual kind of monster itself. And as I mentioned, it does look suspiciously similar to the creature from the movie Desert Shadows. But nonetheless, I still was quite impressed with it. But what I did think was really impressive was the kind of the enhancements of the environment and some of the characters. For example, we have this kind of like lighting effects around this kind of like, you know, this storm and things, this CGI. These kind of like glowing kind of veins that kind of seem to go on the walls, this glowing ooze, things like this. I have to say all were done, and I have to say look pretty good. And you know, not even for a kind of a super low budget movie, but just in general, I actually thought the effects were quite impressive. I mean, the monster effects of them, when we see creatures of itself, when we see two types of or maybe two types of the same creature, if that makes sense. One a kind of baby one and one an adult one. And yes, they're not quite as well realised, but they're still not bad for a you know, low budget kind of movie. Acceptable, I would say, for, you know, if you are used to watching a kind of a B movie style kind of monster movie. So I didn't mind the actual VFX here. And I will say, I think there's actually some reasonable cinematography here. I think, as I mentioned, the lighting, they make good use of lighting in this movie, and some of it is kind of in camera use of kind of setting up shots with kind of the, you know, lights in the actual shot, and some of it is enhanced with the kind of with CGI. But either way, I gotta say, I think it looks, it's quite a well lit movie and quite kind of atmospheric in kind of some aspects. I quite like some of the characterization, and I'm going to say some because there's some that I don't like. But there's one character who is kind of one of this trio, and he's really somewhat of an antagonist to a certain degree as well. But I found his character to be quite interesting. He's kind of like, he seems a little bit unpredictable, and he seems like he might be kind of quite dangerous. But at the same time, I actually think where his kind of story went actually was a fairly kind of like, it lent into the unpredictability, but not necessarily in a typical way. It's kind of like you're not quite sure where he's going to go and how he's going to, character is going to kind of pan out, and it threatens that he might be, you know, untrustworthy and stuff. Will he be? Well, I won't tell you, but I actually kind of quite liked his character, and to be honest with you, the actual kind of like creature idea here, I think is interesting, and the actual plot, although it's nothing you haven't really kind of seen before, I think it's handled with a kind of a mystery kind of style sort of setup, and it does make for a kind of a somewhat of a paranoia-filled movie. The movie's also clearly influenced by like Tarantino. Now, the movie I wouldn't say is Tarantino-esque, if that's a thing, but you can clearly see Tarantino's influence here, particularly on the first half of the movie, which really is the kind of like the gangster style thing. It's the heist. It's these people hiding out after the heist and having kind of conversations and things like this. We even have a suitcase where it has this mysterious kind of prize in it that we never actually know what it is. Very much like your Pulp Fiction style kind of you know, plot device there. So there is certainly influenced by kind of Tarantino, and we do have an action sequence at the sort of towards the beginning of the movie, so we have a little bit of a human on human violence as well. Now, to what doesn't work, unfortunately, I think this movie ultimately is a little dull. It's very low energy, and the movie has two really distinct halves. We get quite an interesting setup with this kind of meteor coming down and affecting this kind of homeless guy, but then we don't see anything of this kind of alien threat at all for a good 45 minutes into the movie. You almost forget you're watching kind of like a science fiction horror film, because it's not even referenced, and instead we get this kind of gangster movie, which eventually kind of then turns into more of a sort of creature survival horror film. But that kind of first half of the movie, ultimately, the first 45 minutes, it's not the most exciting of gangster movies. Let me just put it like this. Now, I think this is down to a number of reasons. Plot-wise, the plot is quite lean. There's not much in regard to narrative in this film. It's three people ultimately carrying out a heist and then waiting for a drop-off, to pick up this kind of suitcase. And that's it. That's your plot. And then there's, we have some alien menace in the second half of the film. There's not a lot there. The characters are quite thin. Now, the movie actually does try to do a job with the characterization, and like I said, there's one guy who I think he does okay, but the other two I didn't feel were particularly kind of rounded. I mean, the one female out this kind of trio of criminals is either constantly crying or screaming, and that's kind of it. She's just either constantly screaming, crying, or whinging. It's one of those three. So it's really not like a particularly kind of well-rounded character, and unfortunately it doesn't help with kind of stereotypes in any way. And the other guy, again, I didn't really feel like we got to know him all that well, though it spends a little bit of time trying to develop their relationships with two of those characters. I didn't really feel it really worked, though. The other thing is as well, this being an Italian movie and spoken in English, I think the majority of the actors here are speaking their second language, which puts a strain on them in regards to acting, I would say. I don't think the acting is terrible, but it's kind of like, had this been like an Italian film with Italian language, then subtitled or English, native English speaking actors, it might have not had this hurdle. But as it stands, you feel like sometimes these guys struggle a little bit with the kind of delivery of lines. And also, sometimes their thick accents make it a little bit hard to understand. In particular, kind of when it's not just clear lines of dialogue. There's instances where, for example, one's hurt and he's kind of whispering and kind of like speaking in a low voice. Can't really understand you, because obviously we have this kind of you're delivering these lines in a way where you're meant to be like rasping and it's quiet, but also because of your accent and the line delivery, it's difficult to understand what was being said and things like this. And just the general pace of the movie, there's just not enough story really to really carry this. And then when we have our kind of alien encounter, although I think it's quite well shot, and like I've said, I didn't mind the CGI, I actually didn't mind the creature design and that sort of stuff. It's fairly low energy. I mean, you just don't feel that this is particularly kind of exciting stuff. It all feels a little bit too slow paced, a little bit too kind of like, people just kind of like not reacting as viscerally as you would expect, or it's never all that exciting to kind of like look at on screen. It's just a little bit low energy. So it ultimately becomes like, I think this movie has some elements that work, but ultimately it's undone, I think, by a slow sense of momentum in the story. And it could have been edited in a way where it flowed a little better. So it's not a bad film, I would say, but I would say it's a slightly below average film. But it is watchable if you don't mind the issues that I've mentioned. So for me, this movie's a 4 out of 10, which is kind of a just below average film for me. It's not a terrible film. It is watchable to a degree, but you know, there you go. I've had my thoughts. So it's a 4 out of 10. Have you heard of this film? Have you seen it? Would you see it based on what I've told you? Please do let me know, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time.